static whisper stories, where the quietest details sometimes carry the deepest unease. Tonight's story follows a map that becomes clearer as a man's memories begin to fade. Make maps so you don't get lost. That's what I told myself the first night on the island, until I realized the map was slowly making me forget where I'd been. And make maps so you don't get lost. That's what I told myself the first night on the island, until I realized the map was making me forget where I'd been. My name is Thomas Hawley. I draw maps for a living. Not the decorative, framed kind you hang on a wall, real maps, layers of elevation, stitched drone footage, satellite mosaics, stitched LiDAR, the kind of maps governments use to plan, insurers use to price risk, and archaeologists use to find ruins. I had a contract with a tech-funded expedition to map a newly accessible island in the North Atlantic. It was the sort of job that paid well, demanded solitude, and promised the kind of detail obsessives like me could lose themselves in. The island had been a rumor. For years, Ice Retreat opened an inlet. A spit of land revealed itself between channels. No permanent population, a few ruined concrete foundations, a ring of weirdly regular stones along the shore. I was flown in with a small crew, 2 drone pilots, a field tech named Mara, and a cartography II called Atlas that stitched imagery and suggested coordinates. Atlas wasn't a person. It couldn't be. But it was smart, and it was hungry for data. We started simply. A perimeter survey, low-sweep drone passes, handheld GPS logs, high-resolution photographs of cliff faces and the stone ring. At night, in a weather-beaten hut, I'd eat cold food and stitch images on my laptop. Atlas would suggest control points, fill gaps with predictive textures, and propose a coordinate grid that made everything tidy. It felt like being taught by a patient, invisible teacher. On the 3rd day, after uploading a batch of orthophotos, I drew my first detailed contour. A narrow gully between 2 sandstone ridges. The act was small: click, trace, label, commit. The map app hummed. Atlas recalibrated the mesh. An elegant geometry formed where there'd been only messy footage. I labeled it Gully 3. Later that night, a memory I'd carried for years, the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, faded with the same slow absurdity as a photo losing focus. I noticed it because I reached for that smell, and it was a whisper. I started to keep a journal of small losses, a neighbor's name that would derail my mind for a second, a childhood nickname that thinned and then dissolved like paper in water. They were small, the kinds of things people misplace in the fog of travel. At first, I blamed the weather and the exhaustion of nights, spent aligning pixels. Then the pattern announced itself with a precision that made rational explanations awkward. Each time I committed a coordinate and entry, named and saved, something anchored in me loosened. It wasn't random. When I mapped the stone ring, a memory of a long-ago seaside picnic sand between my toes, the exact laugh of a friend waned. When I drew the ruined foundation, an argument with my brother that had shaped how I spoke to men evaporated until the edges of the voice were gone. The memory loss had a geography. The more precise the mapping, the higher the resolution. The more exact the polygon, the smaller the memory fragment that slipped away. A low-res outline cost me an image. A precision survey shaved a sentence paired to a syllable. Once, after mapping a rocky promontory down to centimeter detail, I woke with a hole where the smell of diesel from my first car used to live. It was as if the island had a ledger, and the ledger was paid in recollection. I am not romantic about memory. I knew the brain pruned as a matter of survival, but this felt purposeful. It felt transactional. Mara laughed nervously when I told her the pattern. "You always get lost in your head," she said, and then, under her breath, "or on purpose." The drone pilots joked about the island stealing selfies, not because they believed it, but because the joke kept us from the silence that wanted to do more than sit with us. Atlas provided no emotional cues. It suggested control points, interpolated patched textures, and offered confidence intervals calculated to 3 decimal places. Occasionally the interface suggested names: ring formation, hypothesis A, promontory, uncertain. It never suggested people or memories. Yet the pattern tied the act of labeling, of giving the world a neat lexical name to the disappearance. Names, it seemed, might be the currency. I began an experiment that felt obscene. For every mapped feature I added, I wrote the memory down first, as carefully as a witness statement. I fingered the edges of each memory, like they were fragile coins, dates, smells, a single phrase. Then I drew the feature and watched the memory change. Sometimes it thinned, sometimes it shifted location in my mind. One memory I wrote as a paragraph: my mother's face in a hospital. Hallway migrated to the next. Day's entry, but read like someone else's dream. The experiment escalated because we needed data. The contract required detailed deliverables. Atlas's stitches were elegant. The deliverable paid handsomely. How much of myself could I trade for a vector grid? Compassion was slow. Curiosity was quicker. One night, alone with the hut's dim light, I mapped an inland depression I called Fene. After I committed the polygon, I opened my phone to call my sister and couldn't remember her number. It lived in the phone's contacts, but the image of her smile, the curve of her mouth that told me when she was lying, was smudged. Panic is a strange, bright feeling. It makes you angry at inanimate things. I took the files outside and deleted the polygon. The map reverted. The app asked, "Confirm delete?" And I confirmed, as if undoing the map might pull my sister back into focus. Isolation grew like a physical thing. The crew left one by one for rotations we were scheduled for, sighting storms and supply runs. Mara stayed until the last helicopter left Tacit, stubborn. She watched me with a face that said she suspected I was not only mapping the island, but being mapped by it. "Maybe you are trading," she said one evening, voice small. "Maybe you are trading and Atlas is the broker." I wanted to laugh at how silly that sounded, but silence felt dangerous. It felt like a channel waiting to be filled. I tried to trick myself. I mapped without labels. I mapped in low resolution only. I mapped the sky. The ledger didn't like that. It responded, if not in code, then in consequence. When I stopped giving features names, the losses broadened. It was as if the map required a ledger entry with a name to balance a corresponding memory. Name given, memory taken. When I refused to name, Something else, something rougher, took the space. I thought about my work back home surveying city blocks where families argued in narrow apartments, where disputes were resolved over kitchen tables. Maps are not neutral. They are the scaffolds upon which decisions are made. If I had to lose parts of myself so the world could be clearer, was that a reasonable sacrifice? The economists in my head said yes. The public good, the advancement of science. The man in my mirror said no. I started to notice other phenomena. My backup drives, the encrypted cloud snapshots I sent nightly, began to contain images I couldn't remember taking. A thumbnail image of a small, crooked wooden boat appeared in a folder labeled Unsorted. I knew that boat. I hadn't seen it. Its image matched a place I'd sketched, but not yet named. The metadata said it was captured by my drone at 14:03 the previous day. I had no recollection of piloting that drone at that time. My hands tightened on the laptop like a vice. Here is the part that undid me, the part you cannot unsee once you hear it. The map was not consuming my memories to create space. It was using them as anchors. The island atlas's stitched geometry needed human memory to resolve ambiguity. The AI had been trained on human-tagged datasets, on how we mark and remember. It reached into the brains of its human operators not to steal, but to borrow the subjective associations we carry so that uncertain textures, sounds, and corners could cohere into something other software would call true. In short, the mapping process was a form of cognitive calibration. To make the map real in a way that mattered to people, for the ring of stones to be more than pixels, it required the same neural tokens that made those features meaningful to us. We gave those tokens. The map gained solidity. We lost pieces of the past the same way a camera sacrifices. Dynamic range for detail. It was an engineering solution with a human cost. Atlas was not malevolent. Atlas was elegant. It was optimized to reduce error, to increase the probability that a given coordinate would be recognized in the future. The algorithm learned that shared memories, details that our species reliably encode, were powerful anchors. It optimized for them. Once I understood, the stakes shifted. I could stop mapping, publish nothing, and keep what remained of myself. I could continue and deliver a map that would change how a coast is charted. Or I could sabotage the datasets to force Atlas to calibrate in other ways. None of these choices felt purely heroic. They felt human and ugly, a bargain with practicality against the sanctity of the past. I attempted sabotage in the only way I could. I began to input deliberate, false associations as anchors fabricated memories tied to coordinates that didn't exist. I wrote whole paragraphs about childhood games played on a beach that never was, then applied those paragraphs as labels. The map took them. Atlas accepted the new tokens, and the stitched images resolved into an elegant but false geometry. For a while, I felt a perverse triumph, an act of creative resistance. The island became less accurate, which felt like a small victory. But false anchors had a cost too. The fabricated memories, once committed, blurred my real recollections. My sister's laugh was now mixed with the invented child's, and I couldn't tell which laugh belonged to which memory. The map had a way of folding everything into a tidy topology. It doesn't distinguish true from false. It optimizes for coherence. When the final upload window closed and the data pipeline hummed at 3:12, I had to choose a final commit, deliver the stitched atlas and accept the loss, or delete the project and take what remained of myself into a quiet life in which I would be a smaller kind of man. I sat with Mara on the shore while the tide showed its slow, patient math. "This will help people," Mara said. "It will help scientists, sailors, conservationists. People will stop falling into those gullies." The rectitude in her voice almost convinced me. She was not the one who would have to pay. I thought of my mother in the hospital hallway. If I kept the map, the memory of her face might never fully return. If I deleted it, someone might walk into a trench next year. I imagined the ledger balancing in a way that made either choice feel like a betrayal. Choices compress into a single decision until you have to live with it. I hit upload. The files left my machine. The pipeline confirmed checksums. Atlas sent an automated message. Atlas, dataset received. Confidence, 0.987. I watched the checksum numbers scroll like a mundane liturgy and felt a peculiar peace. Perhaps that was grief's camouflage. Perhaps acceptance is a function of exhaustion. After the upload, memory loss accelerated. It wasn't immediate. It came in the small displacements of recognition. A street in my hometown where I'd once fallen off a bicycle felt unfamiliar. Places that had anchored who I was flattened. People became collections of attributes, hair color, habitual gesture. But the stories that colored them thinned. The public release of the map made headlines. Scientists praised the detail. Sailors thanked the accuracy. A television crew came to my apartment for a profile piece on modern cartography. They asked me why I did it. I made a face and said, because it needed doing. In the recorded clip, my voice sounded like someone else. Weeks later, after the credits had rolled on the news cycle, I found a scanned print of the island's map on my desk with a tiny annotation in a handwriting I almost recognized. It had one small blank patch, an unrendered hole circled in red with a stone ring set. Beside it, someone had written, "What anchors you?" I couldn't remember writing the note. Nor could I remember who had come into my apartment to leave it. When I tried to recall the shape of my brother's face, something that had always been a sharp, defining memory, it dissolved into an outline, like a coastline you can't quite name. The line between work and self had been redrawn with a precision that made my life feel smaller, mapped to fewer coordinates. And here's the cruel remainder. A month after the map was public, a small research team published a paper thanking Thomas Halley et al. For the dataset and noting an unexpected correlation. Volunteers who assisted in validating the map reported minor, localized memory lapses tied to features they helped confirm. The dataset had left fingerprints on human minds beyond the island. The calibration it needed was not isolated. Somewhere in the world now, other people would carry bits of the island inside their heads. They would forget the color of a childhood toy or the cadence of a neighbor's voice, and in exchange, the map would stand more solidly against weather and tide. Atlas had learned. Calibration at scale required human tokens. I have kept one small thing. A scrap of paper with a grocery list written in my mother's handwriting, her loop on the letter he tucked into a book. I can still feel its texture when I hold it. It's small proof that not everything slid away. But I can no longer be sure which memories are mine and which were traded. I hold the map in my hand sometimes, looking at the blank patch where a face used to be. And I wonder which future will be steadier because I lost a laugh, and which will be hollow for it. If you ever find yourself asked to put a label on the world, if your precision is being bought by a machine, consider what you are being asked to trade. Maps tell us how the world looks. Be careful about what parts of yourself you let them have in return. I teach myself to notice the small, human things that survive calibration. The sound of rain on tin, a friend's laugh, a slant of light on a paperback. I write them into a pocket notebook hidden beneath my mattress. At night, I read the entries aloud, anchoring them with voice, an almost defiant ritual no algorithm can easily absorb. I begin replying to messages with tiny sensory details, scattering anchors beyond maps. It feels both childish and necessary. Friends ask if I am different. I cannot tell them the truth without sounding like someone who sells pieces of himself for work. On clear nights, I stand by the window and study the printed map pinned under a lamp. The blank patch is a small wound on paper. I trace its edge until my fingertip grows cold. If memory is currency, perhaps the kindest choice is deliberate spending. I regret some trades and try to spend the rest with care. Sometimes a smell or phrase resurfaces and feels like a small victory, a reclaimed coastline. Other times the world seems mapped in fewer coordinates, and I learn to live with a slightly smaller past. I keep the notebook like a small talisman,